Breitbart News Sunday with Joe Pollack and Rebecca Mansour. And you know what that song means. You know what it means. We've been teasing it already. Our very own street fighting man, the man himself, Stephen K. Bannon, is with us. Steve, welcome to the program. You're a man who needs no introduction, really. We just say the street fighting man, and everybody knows who it is.
You guys are too kind, but this is the show we started with at SiriusXM several years ago, the Sunday night show. It's always been my first love at Sirius. Although we do the morning show now, and we've got the Saturday show. We'll have announcements later, doing a lot more. You guys have done a great job. The Sunday show is a way to kick off the news week.
In fact, Steve, I remember back even before we were with SiriusXM, you had the victory sessions on Sunday night with Andrew Breitbart in the studio here in L.A., and that was something special as well.
Those were great.
It's interesting. We had to bring Andrew's lawyer, Joe Pollack, who was also our editor in chief. He doubled as general counsel and editor in chief. So I remember, Joe, if you remember back then, I actually at the victory sessions. It was on KBC. It was a guest-driven show, not audience-driven. I didn't really take a lot of calls. I had Andrew on. I think you were in the studio that night. We had Andrew on, decided to take calls. And Andrew was like in a throwdown with I think the first 5 callers we and it got to be like one of the big shows because Andrew was a fabulous co-host.
God, yeah, and you had some great guests. You know, someday somebody's going to go through those old audio files and find the amazing guests you had. One of the guests that I'll never forget, you had Pat Buchanan on one time, and you were discussing the issue of free trade. And you had said, these people, they have a fetish with free trade, even though our country is being deindustrialized. I'll never forget that. It was just such a great line. And it was like you were already seeing what the issues are going to be and what they became in this election.
It's interesting to say that because, when I left the Daily Show on, I think it was August 12th was the last day I did it, and showed up, took the job of the Trump campaign over that weekend in 2016. I never really, Alex and Raheem kind of jumped in and started doing the Daily Show, but I've always said that all the ideas we had for the campaign really came from the callers. And you can see that even in the victory sessions, the things we were doing back. I think I started victory sessions in the summer of 2011 at KBC. And just the guests we had on, the response we had when Breitbart would do would write up and do the stories with guests, you could see the comment section. It's just simmering. So that's why we love the.
Uh-oh, did we lose Steve?
Steve's fading in and out a little bit.
Bad connection. Uh-oh.
Oh, well, let's see if we can bring him back. But
call it driven.
Oh, Steve, you still there? We're kind of losing you.
Yeah, is that better? I know I'm actually traveling into New York tonight, so it's.
Okay, he's in transit. Yeah, I know. He's always moving around. We can never nail you down. That should strike fear in the hearts of all of the establishment people. Steve is always on the go.
Yeah, people ask me, where is Steve? I say he's everywhere.
Yeah.
or nowhere.
Right.
But listen, we got some big news to announce tonight, and I think a story's coming up momentarily on the site. I want to celebrate it with you guys. But Joe and Rebecca, there's been a bunch of stories about the Breitbart's traffic's off, et cetera, et cetera. Really, we're putting a story up tonight that's got us. We've gone over. I think we were 2.1 billion page views in 2016 with an election year, and this past week we went over 2.2 billion. So we've already surpassed 2016. For a year. So, besides all the snarky articles and Vanity Fair and others, the site continues to explode. It's the 50th biggest site in the country. I think there's only a couple of news sites like the Washington Post, CNN, and the New York Times. I think they're bigger than we are. The thing just continues to build and build and build. And we expect 2017 continue to be a record year, and 2018 we anticipate it's going to be multiples of 2017. So for you guys that are editors, I know you guys shoulder a lot of the burden. It couldn't be a better night to talk about this and to celebrate it.
Well, let's just reiterate that for everybody listening, for the audience who love this show, who love the website, and for the critics who listen to every word. With 10% of the year still left to run, we have broken through last year's record page view numbers at Breitbart.com. This is a website that's growing, that's expanding, that's dynamic, that is reaching more and more and more people despite the efforts of fake news. And I mean hardcore fake news. This is fake news, the definition of the term, to run down our numbers and claim that we're shrinking. We are growing, and it is because of the listeners in this audience and the content on the website. And this is not some sort of late in the year, kind of right before the wire record. This is with 10% of the year still left to run.
And I want you to keep in mind that last year was a presidential election year, which is when everybody's traffic and all of the political websites, all the news websites, that's when their traffic goes up. We are besting our traffic for a historic election in which Breitbart was like the vanguard. Okay, so that's how much we are growing.
This is the key point: is for all the fake news sites out there that have written, "Oh, Breitbart's off," is that the 2016 election had as much intense focus by people that go to news as any, particularly as new voters came in to focus on Donald Trump, and that was a monster year. And the traffic in those months leading up to it, of which I was actually away from the site, and you guys ran, by yourselves, were just massive numbers. The tradition, the rule of thumb, is that traffic normally drops off anywhere from a third to 40%. And although a lot of our competitors have really gotten crushed, here we've increased traffic. I mean, we could do 2.5 billion plus this year. Would be just insane numbers. And so for all the people out there that were, the Media Matters of the world, nobody takes all the analysis Media Matters does. It's really great to put it in your face to show you how dynamic this site is and how big it's growing. And by the way, we've only scratched the surface and how we're going to grow this. New verticals, new international sites, new sites dealing with business and other things. It's just been terrific.
I've been reading the book that just came out about you, Steve, by Keith Koffler, Bannon, Always the Rebel. I encourage people to read it because if you really want to understand Steve's thinking and get some insight into his life and his path. First of all, Steve, your family came from a civil rights background, supported the civil rights struggle, and it just flies in the face of everything that the left and the mainstream media have said. Plus, there's some really meaty ideas here to sink your teeth into. I was telling Rebecca that we ought to provide a reading list for people of the books that Koffler references in this volume because you're such a voracious reader. You have a very wide appetite for history, for philosophy, for politics. And if you want a real education in Western civilization, all you have to do is go through the books Steve has already read. But people come to Breitbart because we're driven by ideas, and these are ideas the rest of the media really don't want to talk about. And we don't always agree with each other about these things. We have different perspectives on the site about trade, about immigration. You come to Breitbart because we're at the core of those debates that everyone else wants to push to the sidelines. That's why we're growing, because people want to hear what the real clash of ideas is about.
I think it sums it up perfectly. Look, I know the book does I haven't had a chance to read it, but I heard it does a really good job of laying out a lot of the ideas that have interested me and driven over time. My parents really weren't civil rights folks. What they were was just people that lived in a neighborhood that started to become segregated. And they refused, which a lot of people did, just to run to the suburbs. This was their home. They bought it for a couple $1,000s back in the 50s. And it's the home my dad still lives in. My mom's passed away. He's 96 years old, but it's still the home that they live in. And they made a great life for us in a segregated neighborhood. It became a real home. And so that's what their thing in the civil rights movement was, not going to go with white flight out to the suburbs, but to stay in the city in Richmond and really build a community and build a neighborhood, which worked out. Joe, your point about the ideas, that's what I think is so exciting about Breitbart and why I love going up on the site every day and being on the editorial calls. There's a clash of ideas. There's a big clash of ideas on the right, and that's one of the reasons there's this kind of civil war. There's this war between the establishment and the grassroots, and the power of the grassroots and kind of this populist movement. It's a movement driven by ideas, big ideas, about our sovereignty, about our place in the world, about nationalism versus globalism. And I think when you see when you hear the callers to the show and you read the comment section, you realize folks are getting coached up. They just can't be spun anymore by politicians kind of giving you happy talk about economics, about trade, about America's national security. So I think the most exciting thing, and I think the reason that we're over 2.2 billion page views today, and will be, I think, 2.5 to 3 billion page views by the time we finish the year, is the simple fact that, people are very excited about this clash of ideas, and they know if they come to Breitbart, they're going to get over. You're not going to get spoon-fed any one philosophy, but you're going to get, a range of ideas, and you can be able to think them through and argue them with your friends.
One of the reasons. One of the reasons I think that people are attracted to Breitbart is the group that Andrew Breitbart assembled around him were often liberal apostates. That is, people who had once voted Democratic or had been liberals, but had seen that it didn't work, and the Democratic Party was descending into leftist progressivism, and had come to a conversion through ideas, through persuasion, through experience. And I just have to read this passage I was talking about earlier about the civil rights background. This is about your mother, Doris. Aside from her vivacity, Doris had another characteristic that stood out in Richmond in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. She was a liberal, opposed to segregation, and vocal about it. And he goes on to say that the Bannons were a little more liberal than most of the folks in that circle. And often the people who believed in that vision of equality were the ones who turned away from the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party isn't about equality anymore, and they're not about working people. And you talk about this all the time, how they've left behind the working class of this country. And you talk also about Black and Hispanic communities and why they should support some of the things that Donald Trump stands for. We know from this book, and also just from knowing your history in the Trump campaign, that you were very much a part of Trump's outreach to Black communities, to Hispanic communities. And is that battle being won? Do you see that battle to gain inroads into the heart of the Democratic Party coalition? Do you see that advancing?
I absolutely do. I think it's the key. As I talk about this new 1932 type of realignment in politics, the central part of that is the Black and Hispanic working class that can unite with us. I think there's, of those two groups of people, they've been hurt more by this rush to globalization. I think the Black working class, I think the Hispanic working class, and particularly the Black working class that kind of comes from the north side of Richmond, where I was raised, are hardworking folks and are people that are very dedicated to building their communities and their families. And they've been the ones that have been eviscerated by this move to globalization and really the unfair competition against global labor and the importing of really illegal aliens to suppress wages to the working class. So I think that they are a natural constituency for this populist movement. I don't think they're getting the answers in the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party gives them a lot of happy talk about identity politics. But I've talked to these groups. I started to talk, I think, 3 or 4 so far. I'm trying to do one every other week. And I can tell you they're hungry for these ideas. They understand something has to change. They also understand they've been taken advantage of, and they're tired of the happy talk. So, I was a small part of the group inside the Trump campaign that said, hey, we've got to do more outreach to these areas. President Trump loved it, right, because he's one of the guys I've ever met that is really about equality of opportunity, and it was a very natural fit for him. That's why going to Flint, Michigan, going to the Black churches up in Detroit, going to Black churches in the school choice programs in Cleveland were so natural to him that, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this, Joel. I think it's one of the central organizing principles around this kind of workers-based, populist movement is the outreach to the minority, the Hispanic, the Asian, and the Black community. And I think once we start locking down, which I've always said, I think we can get a third of that vote, then you're going to see a massive realignment politically in this country.
I think it was an amazing thing. I was so deeply, as a native of Michigander, I was so deeply touched to see Trump campaigning in Detroit, going to Flint. And, Republicans just don't do that anymore. They like John McCain, they abandoned Michigan. Trump really fought for it. And one of the things that also really touched me about the campaign in Michigan was, and I always felt that it was you. I'd never actually confirmed this with you, but I always felt it was a decision that you made. They sent Governor Sarah Palin to these small but important rural communities up north in Michigan, and she was like giving these rally speeches in these town squares that looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. She's like right in the middle of the town square, give it with like apparently a bullhorn, and these people were like all circled around her. And when I saw the election results coming in, and Trump is picking up these really important little rural villages in Michigan, these key little places, I was like, oh my God, that's their Michigan strategy, and it worked. I mean, I've always wanted to ask you about that.
This is why the Detroit Free Press at 9:00 at night called it for Hillary Clinton. People forget this. A very dramatic moment in that election night. The Detroit Free Press, which I don't think has ever been wrong, They called it at 9:15 at night for Hillary Clinton. And then later in the evening, I think it was at 12:15 a.m. on the 9th, they then came back and said it's too close to call. They took it off the Clinton chart. And the reason was, Rebecca, exactly that. We had sent Palin out to rural Michigan. And what it turned out is that the algorithms they were working, based upon the early vote coming out of Detroit, had it as a narrow Clinton win. And as the evening progressed and the rural votes started coming in, they realized they had made a huge mistake. Eventually, on the 5:31, on the 23rd of November, the Detroit Free Press called Michigan for Donald J. Trump. And it was because of the rural. And the other thing was because Donald Trump went to Flint, Michigan. Hillary Clinton never went to Flint. Donald Trump went to Flint.
It's amazing.
And that's what I was really proud of the fact. And by the way, President Trump at the time said, hey, I want to go to all these places, start fitting them in. And it paid off. And that shows you the intensity and the acceptance of the Trump message, the economic nationalist message, which basically says it doesn't matter your race, it doesn't matter your ethnicity, it doesn't matter your color, it does not matter your religion, your gender, your sexual preference. All it matters is that you're a citizen of the greatest republic in mankind's history, the United States of America. That's what matters. You're a citizen, then you get a special deal, right? That you don't have to compete in your own country unfairly against foreign labor. And that's the core message of the Trump populist movement. And it resonated in Michigan. And if we just stay focused, if the White House stays focused, I know it's going to pay big dividends in 18 and huge dividends in 20.
Now, Steve, we've got to ask you about the ongoing battle inside the Republican Party, the Roy Moore race in Alabama, races elsewhere. This is becoming the focal event in the latter part of 2017, heading into the midterm year 2018. The latest polls show Moore is ahead by small margin, larger margin, depending on who you follow. What's the situation down there, and how do you view what's happening in Alabama in relation to your overall mission with regard to taking on the Republican establishment?
Well, as you remember, Mo Brooks was really the guy that we thought had the best chance to win. Congressman Brooks is a populist and a nationalist and somebody that's been very close to Jeff Sessions. It turns out because the White House endorsed, Luther Strange, it ended up that Judge Moore and Strange were in the runoff, and then Judge Moore beat him. It's very obvious to anybody that Mitch McConnell would rather have his seat, go to a Democrat, and in this case, a radical progressive like Doug Jones, a radical on guns, a radical on abortion, a radical on borders, just across the board, than see an insurgent like Judge Moore win this. And I think what people say about these allegations is let folks in Alabama weigh and measure it and let them decide. And so I think you're starting to see that. I think the president has come in the last couple of days and reaffirmed the thing that people in Alabama should make this decision. He tweeted today about the radical nature of Jones and about how he didn't need any more Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer devotees in the United States Senate. So I think this is emblematic of this great battle for the direction and the soul of the Republican Party. Is it going to be a party based upon the principles laid out by Donald Trump in 2016? And quite frankly, the principles that made Mitch McConnell from a minority leader to the majority leader. Remember, in Missouri, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, those candidates wouldn't have won unless Donald Trump carried those states. And he really dragged those guys across the goal line. That's what made Mitch McConnell the majority leader. It's McConnell's, lack of it. McConnell says he goes, I support 96% of the program. It's not good enough. He does not support this program with urgency. He does not support it with intensity. He allows somebody like Bob Corker to make incredibly rude comments about Donald Trump as commander-in-chief in a time of war when we've got young men and women in Afghanistan and South Korea and throughout the globe in harm's way. He allows a guy like Corker to continue to denigrate and deride the president. It's just not acceptable. Mitch McConnell's not acceptable to the grassroots. He's not acceptable to this populist movement. And we've kind of had a throwdown. And we're supporting candidates that's this coalition of about 25 grassroots advocacy groups are coming together to basically vet and endorse certain candidates. And this race is only going to get more intense. December 12th
Steve,
is the runoff. And it's
thank you so much, man. We are going to be following it, as you know, and we're all behind you. You've been listening to Breitbart News Sunday Edition with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour. We're sorry if we didn't get to your calls this week, but please call us back next week right here on SiriusXM Patriot 125, and listen tomorrow to Breitbart News Daily with our editor-in-chief, Alex Marlowe.